Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands as she closed the hood of the military jeep. The engine purred like a satisfied cat, and she allowed herself a small smile. Around her, the motor pool buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared vehicles for another day of training exercises at Fort Henderson. Martinez, get over here! Sergeant Wilson's voice boomed across the garage. Sarah jogged over, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. She had been working as a mechanic at the base for 8 months now, and everyone knew her as the quiet girl who could fix anything with wheels or wings. Yes, sir, she said, saluting smartly. We've got a problem with one of the training planes. Engines making weird noises and the pilots are getting nervous. Think you can take a look? Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course, sir. Which aircraft? The T-6 Texan over at Hangar 3. Pilot says it sounds like a washing machine full of rocks. Sarah nodded and grabbed her toolbox. As she walked toward the hangar, her mind raced. She had worked on dozens of aircraft engines, but she always had to be careful not to show too much knowledge. If anyone discovered that she could actually fly these planes better than most of the pilots on base, her carefully constructed cover would be blown. The hangar smelled of aviation fuel and metal polish. The T-6 Texan sat in the middle, its yellow paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Lieutenant James Parker, one of the younger pilots, stood nearby looking frustrated. Thank God, he said when he saw Sarah approaching. This bird's been giving me trouble all week. Every time I take her up, she sounds like she's about to fall apart. Sarah set down her toolbox and walked around the aircraft, her trained eye noting every detail. The propeller showed signs of slight vibration, and she could see oil stains beneath the engine cowling. But what really caught her attention was something the pilot had missed entirely. The engine mount bolts were loose. When did you first notice the noise? She asked, pulling out her wrench set. 3 days ago. Started as a little rattle, but now it's gotten much worse. Sarah nodded and began removing the engine cowling. As she worked, she thought about her real background, something no one at Fort Henderson could ever know. She had been flying since she was 16, taught by her grandfather who had been a crop duster. By 18, she had more flight hours than pilots twice her age. She had dreamed of becoming a military pilot, but women weren't allowed in combat roles. So she had enlisted as a mechanic instead, figuring it was the closest she could get to the aircraft she loved. What no one knew was that she had been secretly practicing. On weekends, when the base was mostly empty, she would take out the training planes for engine tests. She had taught herself aerobatic maneuvers, combat techniques, and had even practiced air-to-air combat scenarios. Found your problem, she announced, pointing to the loose engine mounts. These bolts have worked themselves loose. It's causing the whole engine to vibrate, which makes that washing machine sound. Lieutenant Parker peered over her shoulder. How did the other mechanics miss that? Sarah shrugged, not wanting to criticize her colleagues. The truth was, most of them focused on obvious problems and didn't have the deep understanding of aircraft that came from actually flying them. When you knew how a plane was supposed to feel in the air, you could diagnose problems that others might miss. As she tightened the bolts and checked the engine timing, Sarah's radio crackled to life. All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. Lieutenant Parker and Sarah exchanged glances. Emergency briefings were rare, and the serious tone in the commander's voice suggested something important was happening. They quickly secured the aircraft and jogged toward the main building. The briefing room was packed with soldiers, pilots, and support staff. Colonel Morrison stood at the front, his face grim. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word from command. We have a situation developing along our eastern border. Enemy aircraft have been spotted making incursions into our airspace. Intelligence suggests they may be planning a larger operation. A murmur went through the crowd. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Real combat. This was what she had been training for in secret. All pilots are to be on high alert, the colonel continued. We may need to scramble fighters at a moment's notice. Maintenance crews, I need every aircraft in perfect condition. We can't afford any mechanical failures. As the briefing continued, Sarah's mind wandered. She thought about the hours she had spent practicing combat maneuvers, the countless times she had run through enemy engagement scenarios in her head. She had studied every manual, memorized every procedure, and trained herself to react instantly to any threat. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her work with renewed focus. She inspected every aircraft with extra care, making sure each one was ready for whatever might come. But deep inside, she felt a frustration that had been building for months. She was probably a better pilot than half the men who would be flying these missions. But she would be stuck on the ground, watching from the sidelines. That evening, as she cleaned her tools in the empty hangar, Sarah made a decision. If the situation escalated, if pilots were needed, she would find a way to help. She had skills that could save lives, and she couldn't just stand by and watch. She walked over to her favorite aircraft, a P-51 Mustang that she had been maintaining for months. She knew every bolt, every wire, every component of this machine. She also knew she could fly it better than anyone else on the base. Maybe someday, she whispered to the silent aircraft, maybe someday I'll get the chance to show what I can really do. Little did she know that someday would come much sooner than she expected, and when it did, everything would change forever. The quiet mechanic who fixed engines and stayed in the background was about to become the most famous pilot in the squadron's history. 3 days after the briefing, Sarah woke to the sound of air raid sirens piercing the early morning silence. She bolted upright in her bunk, her heart pounding. Around her, other personnel scrambled to get dressed and report to their stations. The base erupted into controlled chaos. Sarah grabbed her uniform and ran toward the motor pool, but Sergeant Wilson intercepted her halfway. "Martinez, change of plans. We need you in Hangar 3 immediately. We've got 6 fighters that need immediate inspection before takeoff." Sarah sprinted toward the hangar, her mind already shifting into high gear. As she ran, she could hear the distant rumble of aircraft engines and radio chatter from the control tower. This wasn't a drill. Inside the hangar, 6 P-51 Mustangs sat in formation, their engines already warming up. Pilots were doing final equipment checks while ground crews scurried around each aircraft. Sarah grabbed her inspection checklist and moved to the first plane. "Martinez," Captain Rodriguez, the squadron leader, called out. "How long for a full inspection?" 15 minutes per aircraft, sir. But I can do quick safety checks in 5 minutes each if time is critical. Time is very critical. Enemy bombers spotted heading this way with fighter escorts. We need these birds in the air in 20 minutes. Sarah's training kicked in. She moved from aircraft to aircraft with practiced efficiency, checking control surfaces, fuel lines, ammunition feeds, and engine parameters. Her hands moved automatically while her mind processed the bigger picture. 6 aircraft, 6 pilots, but she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Lieutenant Parker was leaning against hangar wall, his right arm in a sling. "What happened to your arm?" she asked as she checked his assigned aircraft. "Took a spill yesterday during training. Doc says I can't fly for at least 2 weeks. His frustration was obvious. "Captain says they'll have to go up 1 man short." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. 5 aircraft against an unknown number of enemy fighters and bombers. She had studied enough tactical manuals to know those weren't good odds. She finished the inspections and gave Captain Rodriguez the all-clear signal. As the pilots climbed into their cockpits, she caught fragments of radio chatter from the control tower. "Radar contact. 12 bogies inbound. Estimate 20 minutes to intercept. 12 enemy aircraft against 5 defenders." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She knew she could help, but how could she possibly convince anyone to let her fly? She was just a mechanic, and worse, she was a woman. No one would believe she could handle a combat mission. The 5 Mustangs taxied out of the hangar, their engines roaring. Sarah watched them disappear down the runway and into the sky. Then she turned her attention to Lieutenant Parker's aircraft, the 6th Mustang that would remain grounded because there was no pilot. "Damn shame," Sergeant Wilson said, walking up beside her. Perfect aircraft, but no one to fly her. An idea began forming in Sarah's mind. A crazy, dangerous idea that could get her court-martialed or worse. But as she listened to the radio chatter from the control tower, she realized it might be the only chance to even the odds. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "what if someone could fly that 6th aircraft? Hypothetically speaking." Wilson looked at her strangely. "Well, hypothetically, it would help a lot. But we don't have any spare pilots lying around, Martinez. What if we did? What if someone on base had flight training? Martinez, what are you getting at?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would change everything. "Sergeant, I can fly that aircraft. I can fly it well enough to help our guys up there." Wilson stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. "Martinez, you're a mechanic. A damn good one, but still a mechanic. You can't just hop in a fighter plane and start dogfighting." "I've been flying since I was 16, Sarah said quietly. "I have over 800 hours in various aircraft, including 200 hours in P-51s. I know every system, every maneuver, every combat technique. I can help them. The laughter died on Wilson's face. You're serious, dead serious. Check my personnel file if you want. I listed flight experience when I enlisted, but no one ever followed up because I was assigned to maintenance. Wilson pulled out his radio. Captain Rodriguez, this is ground control. We may have found a pilot for the 6th aircraft. Negative, Wilson. All qualified pilots are either airborne or injured. Sir Mechanic Martinez claims to have extensive flight experience. Over 800 hours. There was silence on the radio for several seconds. Then, is she certified for combat operations? Sarah grabbed the radio from Wilson's hands. Sir, this is Martinez. I'm not officially certified for combat, but I know these aircraft better than anyone. I can fly formation, I know air-to-air combat procedures, and right now you need every pilot you can get. Another pause. Then Captain Rodriguez's voice came through, tight with stress. Martinez, we're outnumbered more than 2 to 1 up here. If you think you can help, get that bird in the air. But if you get yourself killed, I'll court-martial your corpse. Sarah was already running toward the aircraft. Understood, sir. Give me 3 minutes to get airborne. She climbed into the cockpit of the P-51, her hands automatically moving through the startup procedures she had memorized years ago. The engine caught immediately. She had tuned it herself just hours before. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah could hear radio chatter from the squadron. They had made contact with the enemy formation. The battle had begun. Tower, this is Martinez requesting immediate takeoff clearance. Cleared for takeoff, Martinez. And Martinez? Yes, sir? Good hunting. Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the Mustang leaped down the runway. As the wheels left the ground, she realized there was no going back now. In a few minutes, she would either prove herself as a combat pilot or die trying. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she had hidden her flying ability, pretending to be just a mechanic. Now she was about to reveal everything in the most dramatic way possible. Her secret was about to become very public, very quickly. As she climbed toward the battle zone, Sarah Martinez was no longer just a mechanic who could fix engines. She was about to become something no one at Fort Henderson had ever seen before, a female combat pilot in the fight of her life. Sarah climbed to 15,000 feet, her eyes scanning the sky ahead. The radio crackled with urgent communications from the squadron already engaged in battle. Red Leader, you've got 2 on your tail. Blue 3, break left, break left. Where's our backup? We're getting hammered up here. Sarah pushed the throttle forward, coaxing every bit of speed from her aircraft. Through her canopy, she could see smoke trails and the glint of sunlight on metal wings in the distance. The battle was happening about 10 miles ahead, and she could already see that her squadron was in trouble. Red Leader, this is Martinez. I'm 5 minutes out. What's your situation? Captain Rodriguez's voice came back strained with effort. Martinez, we've got 8 enemy fighters and 4 bombers. We're down to 4 aircraft. Blue 2 took a hit and had to turn back. These guys are good and they're aggressive. Sarah's mind raced through tactical options. 8 fighters plus 4 bombers against 4 remaining friendly aircraft. Now 5 with her arrival. Still terrible odds, but not impossible if she could use surprise to her advantage. Red Leader, I'm going to come in high and try to break up their formation. Can you lead them toward the canyon? Martinez, are you sure you know what you're doing? Trust me, sir. Sarah climbed another 2,000 feet, positioning herself above the enemy formation. From this height, she could see the entire battle spread out below her. The enemy fighters were flying in 2 groups of 4, protecting the bombers that were heading toward the base. Her squadron was engaged with one group while the other group and the bombers continued toward their target. This was her moment. Sarah rolled the Mustang into a steep dive, building speed as she fell toward the enemy formation. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory from all those years ago. Speed and surprise, Sarah. Those are your best weapons. She lined up on the lead bomber, her finger hovering over the trigger. At 400 yards, she opened fire. Her bullet stitched across the bomber's left wing and she saw pieces of metal fly off. The bomber lurched to one side, black smoke streaming from its engine. Before the enemy fighters could react, Sarah was already pulling up and rolling away. The element of surprise had worked perfectly. For about 10 seconds, enemy fighter high and diving. Came a voice over the enemy radio frequency that she was monitoring. Break formation. The sky suddenly filled with aircraft as the neat enemy formation dissolved into individual dogfights. Sarah found herself face to face with a sleek enemy fighter, its pilot pulling into a tight turn to get behind her. This was where all her secret practice paid off. Sarah yanked her stick hard left and pushed the rudder, performing a perfect split-S maneuver that her grandfather had taught her. The enemy pilot, expecting standard evasive moves, overshot and found himself directly in front of Sarah's guns. She didn't hesitate. A short burst from her machine guns and the enemy aircraft erupted in flames, spinning toward the ground below. "Martinez, nice shooting." Captain Rodriguez's voice carried a note of amazement. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "Long story, sir. I've got another one lining up for a shot." Sarah pulled into a climbing turn, using her aircraft's superior performance to gain altitude on the second enemy fighter. But as she climbed, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The remaining 3 bombers had broken away from the fight and were heading directly toward the base, flying low to avoid radar. "Red leader, the bombers are making a run for the base. I see them, but we're pinned down here. Can you intercept?" Sarah looked at the situation below. Her squadron was heavily engaged with 6 enemy fighters, and she was the only one in position to stop the bombers. 3 bombers against 1 fighter. Not great odds, but she had advantages they didn't expect. She pushed the nose down and dove after the bombers, quickly gaining on them. These were larger, slower aircraft loaded with bombs meant to destroy the base's runways and hangars. If they succeeded, the entire squadron would have nowhere to land. The bomber crew spotted her coming and opened fire with their defensive guns. Tracers streaked past her canopy as Sarah weaved between the streams of bullets. She focused on the lead bomber, knowing that if she could take out the leader, the other 2 might break off their attack. At 300 yards, she opened fire. Her bullets sparked off the bomber's armor plating, but she adjusted her aim and walked her fire into the aircraft's right engine. Oil and smoke began streaming from the engine, and the bomber started to lose altitude. But the other 2 bombers kept coming, and now Sarah was in a crossfire between their defensive guns. A bullet cracked her canopy, and she felt the aircraft shudder as more rounds hit her wings. "Martinez, you've got 2 fighters coming down on you," Captain Rodriguez warned. Sarah glanced up and saw 2 enemy fighters diving toward her. She was trapped between the bombers ahead and fighters behind, with not enough altitude to dive away and not enough speed to climb. This was where her mechanical knowledge became crucial. Sarah knew exactly how much stress her aircraft could take, exactly what it was capable of in extreme situations. She pulled into the tightest turn she could manage, using every bit of the aircraft's structural limits. The enemy fighters, not knowing the Mustang's capabilities as well as Sarah did, couldn't match her turn radius. They overshot, giving her a momentary advantage. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through, coming out directly behind one of the fighters. Her burst was perfectly aimed. The enemy aircraft exploded in a ball of fire. But there was no time to celebrate. The bombers were now only 5 miles from the base, and the remaining enemy fighter was coming around for another attack. Sarah had maybe 2 minutes to stop the bombers before they reached their target. She made a decision that would have been considered insane by any textbook. She flew directly at the lead bomber, head on, her guns blazing. The bomber crew, expecting her to break away at the last second, held their course. Sarah held hers too, firing continuously until the very last moment before pulling up in a violent climb that made her vision gray out from the G-forces. Below her, the lead bomber, hit by dozens of rounds, nosed over and crashed into the desert. 2 bombers left, and they were now close enough to the base that she could see the runways below them. This was where being a mechanic gave Sarah one final advantage. She knew that these bombers would be carrying maximum fuel loads for their long-range mission. A lucky shot in the right place would be catastrophic for them. She lined up on the second bomber and fired a long burst into its fuselage, aiming for where she knew the fuel tanks would be located. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire aircraft disappeared in a massive fireball that lit up the morning sky. 1 bomber left, and it was beginning its bombing run. The final bomber was now directly over the base, beginning its bombing run. Sarah could see the bomb bay doors opening as the aircraft lined up on the main runway. If those bombs hit their target, the entire squadron would be stranded. Sarah pushed her throttle to maximum and climbed desperately, trying to gain altitude for a diving attack. But the bomber was already too low and she was running out of time and ammunition. "Martinez, get out of there," Captain Rodriguez shouted over the radio. "You're too low for a safe attack." Sarah ignored the warning. She had counted her ammunition carefully during the fight. and she knew she had maybe 20 rounds left. 20 rounds to stop a fully loaded bomber. It would have to be enough. She rolled into a steep dive, coming at the bomber from its blind spot beneath the tail. The defensive gunners couldn't depress their weapons enough to hit her, but she would only have seconds before the bomber completed its run and dropped its deadly cargo. At 100 yards, Sarah opened fire with her remaining ammunition. Every bullet had to count. She aimed for the bomber's control cables, hoping to damage the aircraft's ability to maintain level flight during the bombing run. Her tracers sparked along the bomber's fuselage and tail section. She saw pieces of metal fly off the rudder, and the aircraft began to waver slightly. But it was still flying, still on course for the bombing run. Sarah was out of ammunition, but she wasn't out of options. In a decision that would be talked about for decades afterward, she made a choice that no one else would have dared. She aimed her aircraft directly at the bomber's tail section and prepared to ram it. "Martinez, what are you doing?" Captain Rodriguez's voice was filled with alarm. "Saving the base, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "Tell my family I was a good pilot." At the last possible second, Sarah aimed for the bomber's left elevator and pulled the trigger on her empty guns, not to fire, but to steady her hands. Her propeller struck the bomber's tail section, shearing off most of the aircraft's control surfaces. The impact threw Sarah's aircraft into a violent spin, but the bomber had it worse. Without its tail controls, it pitched nose down and crashed into the desert just short of the runway, its bombs exploding harmlessly in empty sand. Sarah fought desperately to regain control of her damaged aircraft. The propeller was bent, the engine was running roughly, and her left wing had taken damage from debris. But the aircraft was still flying, barely. "Martinez, are you all right?" Captain Rodriguez's voice carried relief and amazement. "Aircraft damaged, but still flying, sir. How's the rest of the squadron?" "We've managed to drive off the remaining fighters. They're heading home with their tails between their legs." "Martinez, what you just did was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen." "Maybe both, sir." Sarah carefully nursed her damaged aircraft back toward the runway. The engine was overheating, oil pressure was dropping, and the aircraft wanted to pull to the left due to the damaged propeller. But her mechanical knowledge came in handy once again. She knew exactly how to baby the damaged systems to keep them running just long enough. As she approached the runway, she could see fire trucks and ambulances racing into position. The entire base had watched the aerial battle, and word was already spreading about the mysterious sixth pilot who had appeared from nowhere to save the day. Sarah lowered the landing gear and felt the aircraft shudder as the damaged systems protested. She had one chance to get this right. The aircraft was too damaged for a go-around. The Mustang touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway. Sarah let it roll to the end before turning off, the engine finally giving up and seizing with a grinding mechanical death rattle. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah was surrounded by ground crews, pilots, and base personnel. Everyone was talking at once, asking questions, demanding to know who she was and how she had learned to fly like that. Captain Rodriguez pushed through the crowd and stood in front of her, his face a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Martinez, I've been flying for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you just did up there. Where did you learn combat flying like that?" Sarah took off her helmet and her long hair fell down around her shoulders. A hush fell over the crowd as everyone realized what they had just witnessed. Not just an incredible display of flying skill, but the first time a woman had flown in combat for their squadron. "I taught myself, sir," Sarah said simply. "I've been practicing on weekends when the base was quiet. I love flying, and I love these aircraft. When I heard you were outnumbered, I couldn't just stand by and watch." Colonel Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face stern. For a moment, Sarah thought she was about to be arrested for unauthorized use of military equipment. Instead, the colonel stopped in front of her and slowly began to clap. The applause spread through the crowd until everyone was clapping and cheering. Someone shouted, 6 kills in 20 minutes. Another voice called out, "She saved the whole base." But Sarah barely heard the celebration. She was looking at her damaged aircraft, calculating what it would take to repair the bent propeller, fix the oil leaks, and patch the bullet holes in the wings. Old habits died hard. "Martinez," Colonel Morrison said when the cheering died down, "report to my office in 1 hour. We have a lot to discuss." As the crowd dispersed, Captain Rodriguez stayed behind. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. I should have checked your flight records months ago." "You're one hell of a pilot," Sarah smiled. "Just doing my job, sir." "No, Rodriguez shook his head. What you did up there was way beyond anyone's job. You saved all our lives today. As Sarah walked back toward the hangar to change out of her flight suit, she realized that everything had changed. Her secret was out now. Everyone on the base knew that the quiet mechanic was also an exceptional pilot. There would be questions, investigations, probably a lot of paperwork, but she had proven something important, not just to the military but to herself. She had shown that being a woman didn't make her any less capable as a combat pilot. In fact, her unique combination of mechanical knowledge and flying skill had made her more effective than many traditional pilots. The question now was, what would happen next? Would the military find a way to use her skills officially? Or would she go back to being just a mechanic who happened to have an extraordinary day? One thing was certain. Sarah Martinez would never again have to hide her abilities. The cat was out of the bag and there was no putting it back. 1 hour later, Sarah stood outside Colonel Morrison's office, still in her flight suit. The adrenaline from the mission had worn off and now she was nervous about what came next. Through the door, she could hear multiple voices. This wasn't going to be a private conversation. Come in. Martinez, the colonel called out. Sarah entered to find not just Colonel Morrison, but also Captain Rodriguez, a stern-looking woman in an Air Force uniform she didn't recognize, and a man in civilian clothes taking notes. This was bigger than she had expected. Martinez, sit down, Colonel Morrison said. First, let me introduce everyone. This is Major Patricia Williams from Air Force Personnel Command, and Mr. Thompson from the Department of Defense. They flew in this afternoon specifically to talk to you. Sarah's stomach dropped. DoD involvement meant this was serious, possibly seriously bad for her. Before we begin, Major Williams said, I want you to know that you're not in trouble. What you did this morning was unauthorized, yes, but it also saved this base and possibly dozens of lives. We're here to understand what happened and figure out what comes next. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. Let's start with your background, Mr. Thompson said, consulting his notepad. You enlisted as a mechanic 8 months ago. Your file shows you listed some flight experience, but no formal training. Can you elaborate? Sarah took a deep breath. My grandfather was a crop duster and flight instructor. He started teaching me when I was 16. By the time I enlisted, I had logged over 800 hours in various aircraft, including about 200 hours in military fighters. Wait, Major Williams interrupted. You had 200 hours in military aircraft before you enlisted? How? My grandfather had connections at several bases. During weekends and summers, I would help with maintenance and occasionally take aircraft up for test flights. Everyone assumed I was there as his assistant, and since the flights were logged as maintenance tests, no one questioned it. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. Martinez, are you telling us you've been qualified to fly these aircraft for years? Yes, sir. More than qualified. I know every system, every limitation, every capability of these aircraft because I've worked on them and flown them extensively. Mr. Thompson made more notes. What about combat training? Today wasn't just flying. You engaged in air-to-air combat against experienced enemy pilots. Sarah felt more confident discussing this. I've studied every combat manual I could get my hands on. I've run through hundreds of combat scenarios mentally, and I've been practicing advanced maneuvers during my unauthorized weekend flights. Unauthorized flights? Major Williams's eyebrows shot up. Sarah realized she had just admitted to something else that could get her in serious trouble. Yes, ma'am. When the base was quiet on weekends, I would take aircraft up for what I logged as engine tests. But I was really practicing combat maneuvers and aerobatics. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Captain Rodriguez started laughing. Sir, are you all right? Colonel Morrison asked. Sorry. Rodriguez wiped his eyes. It's just that Martinez has been giving us perfect aircraft for months. Every plane she worked on flew better than when other mechanics touched them. Now I know why. She was actually test flying them to make sure they performed properly. Is that true, Martinez? Major Williams asked. Yes, ma'am. I couldn't stand the idea of sending up an aircraft that wasn't performing at its best, so I would test fly them to make sure everything was perfect. Mr. Thompson looked up from his notes. Martinez, in your opinion, how would you rank your flying abilities compared to the other pilots on this base? Sarah hesitated. This felt like a trap, but she decided to be honest. Sir, I believe my combination of mechanical knowledge and flight experience makes me as capable as anyone here, possibly more so in certain situations. Such as today? Major Williams prompted. Yes, ma'am. I knew exactly what my aircraft could handle because I had built and maintained it myself. I knew which maneuvers were safe and which were at the edge of structural limits. That knowledge allowed me to make tactical decisions that other pilots might not have been able to make. Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair. Martinez, what you accomplished today was remarkable. 6 enemy aircraft destroyed, a bombing run stopped, and you brought your damaged aircraft home safely. But it also raises some serious questions about our personnel policies. Major Williams nodded. Martinez, you're clearly qualified to be a pilot, not a mechanic. The question is what we do about it now. Ma'am, I love working as a mechanic, Sarah said quickly. I love understanding these aircraft from the inside out. I just also love flying them. What if you could do both? Mr. Thompson asked. What if we created a new position that utilized both your mechanical expertise and your flying abilities? Sarah's heart began to race. Was this really happening? Major Williams consulted a folder she had brought. Martinez, the military is changing. We're beginning to recognize that we've been wasting talent by limiting roles based on gender rather than ability. What you proved today is that combat effectiveness is about skill, knowledge, and courage, not gender. The Department of Defense is launching a pilot program, Mr. Thompson continued. We're looking for exceptional individuals who can serve as test pilots, combat pilots, and technical specialists. Based on what happened today, you'd be perfect for this program. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sir, are you offering me a chance to fly officially? We're offering you a chance to do much more than that, Colonel Morrison said. We want you to help us train other pilots. Your combination of mechanical knowledge and flying skill is exactly what we need for our new advanced training programs. There's one catch, Major Williams added. This program is experimental. You'd be one of the first women in an official combat pilot role. There will be scrutiny, criticism, and pressure. Some people won't accept that a woman can do this job, regardless of your proven abilities. Sarah thought about all the months she had spent hiding her abilities, pretending to be just a mechanic while dreaming of flying. Ma'am, I've been dealing with people who don't think I belong in aviation my whole life. But every time I prove them wrong, it gets a little easier for the next woman who wants to fly. Captain Rodriguez smiled. Martinez, if you're half as good in the air tomorrow as you were today, those critics won't have a leg to stand on. So what's your answer, Martinez? Colonel Morrison asked. Are you interested in making this official? Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her. These people were offering her everything she had ever dreamed of. The chance to fly officially, to use all her skills, and to prove that women could excel in combat aviation. Yes, sir. Absolutely yes. Excellent, Major Williams said, standing up. Welcome to the Advanced Combat Pilot Program, Lieutenant Martinez. Lieutenant? Sarah stammered, effective immediately. Your combat performance today earned you a field promotion. Congratulations. As the meeting broke up and hands were shaken, Sarah realized that her life had just changed completely. She was no longer the hidden pilot, the secret fighter. She was now officially what she had always been in her heart, a combat pilot. But as she left the office, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, proving that today wasn't a fluke, that she could perform consistently at this level, and that she deserved the opportunity. She had been given the quiet mechanic who had shocked everyone with her flying skills was about to become something even more extraordinary. A pioneer who would open doors for generations of women who shared her dreams of flight. 6 weeks after her promotion, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood in front of a classroom full of male pilots, all of whom had significantly more official flight time than she did. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to teach air combat tactics to men who had initially questioned whether she should even be allowed to fly. Today we're going to discuss energy management in air-to-air combat, Sarah began, pointing to diagrams on the blackboard. The key is understanding not just your aircraft's capabilities but your opponent's limitations. In the back row, Captain Mike Stevens raised his hand. Stevens had been one of the most vocal critics of Sarah's promotion, arguing that one successful mission didn't qualify her to train experienced pilots. Lieutenant Martinez, he said with barely concealed skepticism, this is all textbook theory. How do we know these tactics work in real combat? Sarah had been expecting this question for weeks. Captain Stevens, would you like a practical demonstration? Stevens smirked. You mean like a training flight? I mean like a combat simulation. You and me, one-on-one, using the tactics I've just explained. The classroom fell silent. Stevens had over 500 hours of official combat flight time and was considered one of the squadron's best pilots. Sarah was essentially challenging the most experienced pilot in the room to prove her teaching methods. "You're on, Lieutenant," Stevens said confidently. An hour later, both pilots were in the air at 20,000 feet, with the rest of the squadron watching from the ground via radio and radar tracking. The exercise was simple, a dogfight simulation using paint rounds instead of live ammunition. "Blue Leader, this is Control," came the voice from the tower. "Begin exercise when ready." Sarah immediately put her aircraft into a steep climb, gaining altitude rapidly. Stevens, following standard doctrine, tried to match her climb to prevent her from gaining a tactical advantage. This was exactly what Sarah had expected. She had studied Stevens's flying style for weeks, watching him in training exercises. He was technically proficient and followed established procedures perfectly, but he was predictable. At 25,000 feet, Sarah suddenly rolled inverted and dove toward Stevens's aircraft. Stevens, caught off guard by the unexpected maneuver, tried to turn away. But Sarah had calculated this move based on her mechanical knowledge of both aircraft's performance characteristics. Her aircraft, lighter due to less fuel, could outclimb Stevens's fully loaded fighter. When she dove, she had both altitude and speed advantages. Stevens was caught in exactly the position Sarah had planned. "Paint rounds fired," Sarah announced calmly over the radio. "Direct hit on Blue Leader's starboard wing." On the ground, the radio crackled with amazed voices from the other pilots. She got him in under 2 minutes. How did she do that? Stevens's voice came over the radio, professional despite his surprise. "Good hit, Lieutenant. Request to reset and try again." "Granted," Sarah replied. "But this time, try to think like your aircraft is a machine, not just a weapon." The second engagement lasted longer, with Stevens trying to use his superior experience to outmaneuver Sarah. But again, Sarah's deep understanding of aircraft systems gave her unexpected advantages. When Stevens tried to outturn her in a classic maneuver, Sarah used a technique she had learned from her grandfather, using the aircraft's torque characteristics to achieve a tighter turning radius than the manual said was possible. Paint rounds fired. Direct hit on Blue Leader's tail section. This time the radio silence lasted longer. "Blue Leader, how did she get behind you so quickly?" someone asked. "I have no idea," Stevens admitted. "Lieutenant Martinez requests immediate debrief. I need to understand what just happened." Back on the ground, Stevens approached Sarah with a completely different attitude. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. I've been flying for 8 years and I've never seen anyone use aircraft performance characteristics the way you just did." Sarah extended her hand, and Stevens shook it firmly. "Captain, you're an excellent pilot. The difference is that I understand these aircraft as machines first, weapons second. When you know exactly what the machine can and can't do, you can push it in ways that surprise your opponent." "Is that what you did today during the real combat mission?" asked Lieutenant Parker, who had been watching the exercise with his arm still in a sling. "Exactly. I knew my aircraft could handle maneuvers that looked impossible because I had built and tested those systems myself. I also knew the enemy aircraft's limitations because I had studied their technical specifications." Captain Rodriguez joined the group. "Martinez, I want you to develop a new training program based on what you just demonstrated. If we can teach our pilots to think like you do, we'll have a significant tactical advantage." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into developing the new training curriculum. She combined traditional air combat tactics with detailed technical knowledge about aircraft systems. Pilots learned not just how to fly their aircraft, but how to understand every component, every limitation, and every capability. The results were dramatic. Pilots who had gone through Sarah's training program showed significant improvement in simulation exercises. More importantly, they developed an intuitive understanding of their aircraft that made them more effective in real combat situations. But Sarah's success also brought unwanted attention. News of the female pilot who had shot down 6 enemy fighters spread beyond the base, reaching newspapers and radio stations. Suddenly, Sarah found herself at the center of a national debate about women in combat roles. Some praised her as a hero and a pioneer. Others criticized the military for putting women in dangerous positions. Sarah tried to stay focused on her work, but the controversy was becoming harder to ignore. The situation came to a head when a reporter from a major newspaper arrived at the base, demanding an interview. Colonel Morrison called Sarah into his office to discuss how to handle the media attention. "Martinez, this is bigger than just our base now," the colonel explained. "The Department of Defense is watching closely. Your success here could influence policy for the entire military. Sir, I just want to do my job and train pilots. I never asked to become a symbol or a political statement. I know, but that's what you've become. The question is how you want to handle it." Sarah thought about all the young women who might be interested in aviation, but believed it wasn't possible for them. She thought about her grandfather, who had always told her that talent had nothing to do with gender. "Sir, if my story can encourage other qualified women to pursue aviation careers, then I think I should tell it. But I want to make it clear that this isn't about proving women are better than men. It's about proving that the best qualified person should get the job, regardless of gender." "That's exactly the right message, Lieutenant. Are you ready to speak to the press?" Sarah straightened her uniform and checked her reflection in the colonel's window. The quiet mechanic who had hidden her abilities for so long was about to become the public face of women in military aviation. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." As she walked toward the interview, Sarah realized that her real mission was just beginning. Shooting down enemy aircraft had been the easy part. Now she had to shoot down decades of prejudice and assumptions about what women could accomplish in aviation. But if anyone was qualified for that mission, it was the pilot who had surprised everyone by turning out to be exactly what the military needed, regardless of what they had expected. 2 years later, Colonel Sarah Martinez stood on the reviewing stand at Fort Henderson, watching the graduation ceremony for the first class of the Advanced Combat Pilot Program. 24 pilots stood at attention below, and 8 of them were women, a number that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Sarah's promotion to colonel had come faster than anyone expected, but her results spoke for themselves. The training program she had developed was now being used at bases across the country, and pilot effectiveness had improved by an average of 30%. More importantly, the program had proven that the best pilots came from those who truly understood their aircraft, regardless of their background or gender. "Colonel Martinez," said General Patricia Williams, who had been promoted and was now overseeing the expansion of the program to other branches of the military. "Are you ready to address the graduates?" Sarah nodded and stepped to the microphone. 2 years ago, she had been terrified of speaking to a single classroom. Now she was comfortable addressing hundreds of people, knowing that her words carried weight and could influence military policy. "Pilots," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. 2 years ago, this program didn't exist. Many of you were told that your unconventional backgrounds as mechanics, engineers, or women meant you couldn't succeed as combat pilots. She paused, looking at the faces of the graduates. Some were young men fresh out of flight school. Others were experienced mechanics like she had been. 8 were women who had fought against decades of discrimination to reach this point. But you proved something important. Excellence in aviation isn't about following someone else's idea of what a pilot should look like. It's about understanding your aircraft, mastering your skills, and having the courage to act when the moment demands it. In the audience, Sarah could see her grandfather, now 83 years old, sitting in a wheelchair but beaming with pride. Next to him sat Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, fully recovered from his training accident and now serving as Sarah's deputy in the training program. "The enemy doesn't care about your gender, your background, or whether you took a traditional path to the cockpit," Sarah continued. "They only care about whether you can outfly them, outthink them, and complete your mission. And based on the simulation results from your training, I'm confident that every one of you can do exactly that." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters and military officials. The media attention had never completely died down, but she had learned to use it effectively to promote the expansion of opportunities for qualified pilots, regardless of their backgrounds. "Colonel Martinez," asked a reporter from Aviation Weekly, "what's next for the Advanced Combat Pilot Program?" "We're expanding internationally," Sarah replied. "Allied nations have seen our results and want to implement similar programs. We're also beginning to work with civilian aviation schools to identify candidates who might succeed in military aviation." "And personally, what's next for you?" Sarah smiled. "I'm still a pilot first, administrator second. I fly regular missions to stay current, and I still personally test new aircraft that come through our program." "You can't teach what you don't actively practice." As the crowd dispersed, Captain Rodriguez approached her. He was now Major Rodriguez and served as the base operations officer. "Sarah," he said, using her first name as he had been given permission to do in private conversations. "Do you ever think about that morning 2 years ago? When you climbed into that 6th aircraft?" "Every day," Sarah replied honestly. "Not because I regret it, but because it reminds me how many qualified people might be overlooked if we only look in traditional places." "The official history of that mission is going to be taught at the Air Force Academy," Rodriguez said. "They're calling it the perfect example of adaptability and individual initiative in combat." Sarah laughed. "I hope they also mention the importance of maintenance personnel who understand their equipment. Half of my success that day came from knowing exactly what my aircraft could handle, because I had built and maintained it myself." Later that evening, Sarah walked through the hangar where her story had essentially begun. The same P-51 Mustang she had flown into combat 2 years ago sat in the corner, now restored and serving as a training aircraft. She ran her hand along its wing, remembering the bullet holes that had once peppered this metal. Lieutenant Jennifer Chen, one of the recent graduates and the first Asian American woman to complete the program, approached her. "Colonel, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't taken that aircraft up that day?" Sarah considered the question. "I think someone else would have stepped up eventually. Maybe not that exact day, but progress was inevitable. I just happened to be the person in the right place at the right time with the right skills. But you changed everything for women in aviation." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I just proved what was always true. That skill and dedication matter more than assumptions about who can or can't fly. The change was already happening. I just happened to make it visible in a dramatic way." As they walked toward the exit, Sarah's radio crackled. "Colonel Martinez, we have an emergency situation developing. Unknown aircraft approaching the border, and we need our best pilot to lead the intercept mission." Sarah was already moving toward her aircraft before the transmission finished. "Lieutenant Chen, want to see how we handle a real-world situation?" "Yes, ma'am." As they jogged toward the flight line, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. 2 years ago, she had been a mechanic pretending not to know how to fly. Now she was leading missions and training the next generation of pilots, but some things hadn't changed at all. She still got the same thrill when approaching an aircraft, still felt the same sense of purpose when climbing into the cockpit, and still believed that the best pilot was simply the one who understood their machine and their mission better than anyone else. "Let's go flying," Sarah said as she climbed into her aircraft. "Time to show these new pilots how it's done." As her aircraft lifted off the runway, Sarah Martinez, the former mechanic who had hidden her abilities, the pilot who had saved a base against impossible odds, the colonel who had revolutionized military aviation training, was simply doing what she had always been meant to do. She was flying. And in the hangar below, 8 newly graduated female pilots watched their commander disappear into the sky, knowing that because of her courage 2 years ago, they now had the opportunity to follow their own dreams of flight. The quiet mechanic who had shocked the world by taking down 6 enemy fighters in 20 minutes had accomplished something even more important. She had opened the sky to everyone qualified to fly in it. Her grandfather would have been proud.